Doctor adjusted his environmental scanner for the third time that morning, the device's soft, beeping barely audible over the distant calls of alien wildlife. 3 months into his xenobiology research mission on Prime, he had grown accustomed to the planet's strange rhythms. The twin suns cast everything in a golden amber light that made the crystalline trees shimmer like frozen fire. What he hadn't grown accustomed to was the feeling of being watched. It started 2 weeks ago, a prickle between his shoulder blades whenever he ventured into the deeper sections of the forest. His rational mind dismissed it as paranoia, a natural response to working alone on an alien world where every shadow could hide something lethal, but had survived 4 previous xenobiology expeditions by trusting his instincts, and his instincts were screaming that something was tracking him. "Base camp this is," he spoke into his comm unit while carefully extracting a sample from a phosphorescent mushroom cluster. "I'm approximately 2 clicks northeast of my previous position, everything nominal." The response crackled through with typical delay. "Copy that. Remember, you're scheduled for supply drop in 6 days. Dr. Reeves wants to know if you need any additional equipment." Paused, considering whether to mention his growing unease. The Galactic Research Council had invested significant resources in this mission. Prime was the first planet discovered with a biosphere that seemed almost Earth-like, yet evolved completely independently. The implications for understanding life in the universe were staggering. The last thing he wanted was to appear unstable or request an early extraction over what might be nothing more than researcher fatigue. "Negative on additional equipment," he replied. "I'll submit my full report with the next data burst." As he sealed the sample container, a branch snapped somewhere behind him. Froze, every muscle tense. The sound came from approximately 50 meters away, too heavy to be caused by any of the small creatures he'd so far. He slowly reached for the stunner clipped to his belt, a precaution that had seemed unnecessary until recently. "Is someone there?" he called out in standard Galactic, then repeated the phrase in the 3 most common trade languages. Only the whisper of wind through crystal leaves answered him. Had read the initial survey reports thoroughly. Prime showed no signs of sentient life. The most complex organisms detected were small mammalian equivalents with intelligence roughly comparable to Earth's raccoons. The planet had been cleared for solo research precisely because it was considered safe. Yet something in those reports nagged at him, a detail that had been bothering him for weeks. The original survey team had spent only 2 months on planet, focusing primarily on mineral composition and atmospheric analysis. Their biological survey had been limited to automated drones and surface scans. Comprehensive xenobiology research required the kind of extended fieldwork was conducting. If there was something living in the deeper forests, something intelligent enough to avoid detection by orbital scans and robotic surveys, the original team might never have encountered it. He continued his work with heightened awareness, documenting the remarkable biodiversity that made Prime so scientifically valuable. The planet's life forms showed an incredible range of adaptation strategies. He discovered flowering plants that generated their own electrical fields, insects that could phase shift through solid matter for short periods, and small mammals that could manipulate local gravity to glide between the towering crystal trees. But it was the absence of certain life forms that struck him as odd. For a planet teeming with biological diversity, there were surprisingly few large predators. The ecosystem seemed almost deliberately balanced, as if some intelligence had been managing it, had learned not to dismiss such observations. Nature rarely created perfect balances without some form of regulation. As afternoon shifted toward evening, he made his way back toward base camp through increasingly familiar territory. The research station was a modest affair, a prefabricated shelter with basic life support, laboratory equipment, and communication gear. It sat in a clearing about a kilometer from the forest edge, providing clear sight lines in all directions while remaining close enough to his primary research area. The feeling of being watched intensified as he approached the clearing, stopped at the tree line and carefully scanned his surroundings. The base camp appeared undisturbed, exactly as he'd left it that morning. Security sensors would have alerted him to any intrusion, but he'd learned to trust his own senses over technology when working in alien environments. That night, as he processed the day's samples and updated his research logs, found himself glancing frequently at the security monitors. The infrared feeds showed the normal heat signatures of small nocturnal creatures moving through the forest, but nothing unusual. Still, he couldn't shake the sensation that something was out there, watching, waiting. He was reviewing spectral analysis data when movement on the edge of Monitor 3 caught his attention. A heat signature, larger than anything he'd seen before, moving with purpose along the forest edge, leaned forward, adjusting the display resolution. The signature was roughly humanoid, but with proportions that seemed slightly off. Before he could get a clear reading, it vanished into the crystal trees. "Probably just equipment malfunction," he muttered, but made a note to run full diagnostics on the security system in the morning. Sleep came fitfully. Found himself waking repeatedly, listening for sounds that never came. When he finally drifted into deeper sleep, his dreams were filled with golden eyes watching from shadow-filled forests. He woke to the soft chime of his alarm and the realization that something had changed during the night. The air in his shelter carried a scent he didn't recognize, musky, wild, but somehow not unpleasant. It reminded him of something, though he couldn't quite place what. The morning security review showed nothing unusual. Whatever had triggered the heat signature the night before had either moved on or learned to avoid detection. Ran the promised diagnostics on all his equipment and found everything functioning within normal parameters. Yet the strange scent lingered, even after he'd cycled the air filtration system twice. "Base camp, this is. Beginning today's field work. All systems green." "Copy that. Weather satellite shows a storm front moving in from the east. Should reach your position in approximately 36 hours. Might want to plan accordingly." Acknowledged the warning and gathered his equipment. Storm seasons on Prime could be spectacular and dangerous, with electrical displays that interfered with most electronic devices. He'd need to complete his current survey grid before the weather forced him to take shelter. The morning's work proceeded normally until he discovered something that made him stop and stare. There, pressed into the soft ground near a stream he'd been sampling, was a clear footprint. Not human, but clearly made by something bipedal and intelligent. The print showed 5 toes with what appeared to be retractable claws and was roughly the same size as his own foot. Carefully documented the print from every angle, taking measurements and soil samples. The depth and clarity suggested the creature that made it was roughly his own weight, possibly slightly less. More intriguingly, the print was fresh made within the last few hours based on the soil moisture and lack of degradation. As he worked, he became aware of a sound he'd been hearing for days without really noticing it. A soft, rhythmic noise that he'd unconsciously attributed to wind patterns or settling crystal trees. Now, listening carefully, he realized it sounded almost like breathing, slow, controlled breathing coming from somewhere in the forest around him. "I know you're there," he called out, feeling slightly foolish but unable to shake his certainty. "I'm not here to harm you or your territory. I'm a researcher trying to understand this world." The breathing stopped. Then, after a long moment, came a sound that made his heart race. It was definitely a voice, though not speaking any language he recognized. The tone was curious rather than threatening, with a quality that seemed almost feminine. Forced himself to remain calm. First contact protocols were clear, though they'd been designed with the assumption that any sentient species would be technologically advanced enough to signal from space. This situation fell into uncharted territory. "My name is," he said clearly, pointing to himself. "I come in peace." A rustle of movement from the crystal trees, then silence. After several minutes with no further contact, reluctantly continued his work. But he made sure to move slowly and avoid sudden gestures that might be interpreted as threatening. The rest of the day passed without incident, though he continued to feel watched. As he prepared to return to base camp, made a decision that went against all standard protocols. He deliberately left one of his ration packs near the site where he'd found the footprint, along with a simple metal cup filled with clean water. "If you're hungry or thirsty," he said to the apparently empty forest, "these are safe. Consider them a gift." That night, he monitored the security feeds with particular attention to the area where he'd left the offerings. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just before dawn, a figure appeared at the edge of the camera's range. The image was frustratingly unclear, but could make out a roughly humanoid shape moving with fluid grace. The figure approached his gifts cautiously, then quickly retreated back into the forest with both items. Smiled despite himself. First contact had been made, even if it was unofficial and completely outside standard procedures. But as he studied the brief footage, one detail stood out that made his breath catch. In the split second when the figure had turned toward the camera, he'd caught a glimpse of a face that was definitely not human, but undeniably intelligent. And those eyes, even in the poor light of pre-dawn, seemed to glow with an inner fire. He was no longer alone on Prime. The question was whether that was a blessing or a curse. The approaching storm would soon force him to remain at base camp for several days. If his mysterious watcher was planning to make contact, that might provide the perfect opportunity. Began preparing for the possibility that his mission was about to become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. As he settled down for what he hoped would be a more restful night's sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The scent in the air seemed stronger now, carrying notes he almost recognized. Something wild and free, but also unmistakably alive and aware. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries. He was certain of it. The storm arrived ahead of schedule, bringing with it electrical displays that painted the sky in brilliant purples and greens. Had secured his equipment and sealed the research station's exterior panels, but the electromagnetic interference made communication with the orbital relay impossible. For the next 2 days, he would be completely cut off from the outside universe. He didn't mind the isolation as much as he'd expected. The storm provided cover for whatever was living in the forest, and had a strong suspicion his mysterious watcher might use the opportunity to investigate his base camp more closely. He'd positioned his internal sensors to record everything while maintaining the appearance of normal storm protocols. The first day passed quietly, with catching up on data analysis and equipment maintenance. He'd compiled an impressive catalog of Prime's biodiversity, but the discovery of an intelligent inhabitant changed everything. His mission parameters didn't include first contact procedures for previously unknown species. Technically, he should abort his research and request immediate evacuation so a proper diplomatic team could handle the situation. But something held him back from triggering an emergency beacon. The creature had shown no signs of hostility. If anything, its behavior suggested curiosity rather than aggression. More importantly, had spent enough time studying alien ecosystems to recognize when something was fragile. A full Galactic Research Council response might overwhelm whatever delicate balance existed on Prime. The second night of the storm brought the first real contact. Was reviewing spectral analysis data when every motion sensor in his base camp activated simultaneously. He quickly switched to internal monitoring and felt his heart skip as he watched a figure moving around his shelter with obvious intelligence. The being was examining his solar collectors, atmospheric processors, and communications array with what appeared to be scientific interest. The external cameras provided his first clear look at his visitor and found himself staring in fascination. The creature was definitely female, though her anatomy suggested evolutionary paths completely different from human development. She stood roughly his height, but moved with the fluid grace of a natural predator. Her body was covered in what appeared to be fur that shifted color like liquid metal, predominantly amber and gold with darker patterns that reminded him of a fox's markings. But it was her face that held his attention. While clearly non-human, her features carried an intelligence and expressiveness that transcended species boundaries. Large, luminous eyes that seemed to glow with internal light. Delicate features that suggested both strength and femininity. And when she turned directly toward one of his cameras, could swear she was smiling. She knew he was watching. More than that, she was putting on a show for his benefit. For the next hour, she systematically examined every piece of external equipment, always careful not to damage anything. Her movements were purposeful and methodical, suggesting familiarity with technology. This wasn't a primitive being encountering advanced machinery for the first time. This was someone who understood what she was looking at. Finally, she approached the main entrance to his shelter and did something that made his breath catch. She knocked, 3 deliberate raps on the sealed door, then stepped back and waited. Every protocol had ever learned screamed against opening that door. Standard procedure for contact with unknown species required controlled environments, protective barriers, and multiple safety redundancies. But those protocols had been written by bureaucrats who'd never faced the reality of genuine first contact. This being had had multiple opportunities to harm him or his equipment, and had chosen not to. She was extending what could only be interpreted as a gesture of peaceful intent. Made a decision that would either be remembered as brilliantly intuitive or catastrophically stupid. He activated the shelter's external speakers. "Hello," he said clearly. "I can see you're intelligent and curious about my equipment. I'd like to communicate with you, but I need to know you understand that I mean no harm." The being tilted her head, listening carefully. Then she did something unexpected. She placed her hand flat against the door and spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the storm sounds. While the words were in no language recognized, the tone was unmistakably friendly. She was trying to communicate. "Wait here," said, holding up one finger in what he hoped was a universal gesture. "I have something that might help." He retrieved his translation matrix, a device designed to identify patterns in unknown languages and build basic communication protocols. It wasn't perfect, but it had proven useful in previous encounters with pre-technological species. Activated the unit and placed it near the door's external speaker. "Can you hear this?" he asked, the device immediately beginning to analyze his speech patterns. The being responded with a flowing series of sounds that were definitely language. The translator began its work, identifying vocal patterns and attempting to match them with known linguistic structures. After several minutes of back and forth, the device chimed softly. "Basic pattern recognition established," announced the translator in its neutral voice. "Beginning communication protocol." What followed was halting but remarkable. Over the course of an hour, with the translator becoming more sophisticated with each exchange, learned that his visitor called herself something that roughly translated as Swift Golden Hunter, but could be shortened to a sound he could approximate as. She confirmed that she belonged to a species that lived deep in the crystal forests, and that she had been observing him since his arrival. More intriguingly, she seemed to understand concepts of research and scientific exploration. When explained his purpose on Prime, she responded with what the translator interpreted as excitement rather than concern. She wanted to know about the worlds beyond the sky, about the species that traveled between stars, about the vast community of intelligent beings that made up galactic civilization. "Your people," asked carefully, "are there many of you?" The pause before her answer was telling. "Few," came the translated response. "Very few now. The sickness came many cycles ago. Most went to the deep places and did not return. I am the last in this region." Felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. He was talking to what might be one of the last members of her species. The implications were staggering. If people were facing extinction, contact with galactic civilization might represent their only hope for survival. But it also meant that any mistakes made could result in the loss of an entire species. "I would like to help," he said carefully. "My people, the humans, we know about sickness. We might be able to find ways to heal your people." "Help," she repeated, the word coming through clearly without translation. She had grasped the concept and was learning Standard Galactic with remarkable speed. "Yes, but first, understanding needed, trust needed." Over the next several hours, as the storm raged around them, and conducted the most remarkable conversation of his career. She possessed a sophisticated understanding of her world's ecosystem, and had been managing the forest's balance for what he calculated might be decades. The absence of large predators that had puzzled him wasn't natural selection. It was careful stewardship by an intelligence that understood ecological principles. She also revealed something that changed his entire perspective on his mission. The crystal trees weren't just remarkable geological formations. They were alive, a form of silicon-based organism that existed in symbiosis with the forest's carbon-based life forms. More than that, they formed a kind of communication network that people had learned to interface with directly. "You study the small things," she said with what he was learning to recognize as amusement. "But you miss the great thing. The forest thinks. The forest remembers. The forest has been waiting for visitors from the sky rivers." The implications were staggering. Realized he wasn't just studying an alien ecosystem. He was in contact with a form of planetary intelligence that existed on a scale beyond anything in human experience. And people were apparently the key to understanding how it all worked. As dawn approached and the storm began to subside, prepared to leave. But before departing, she made an offer that left speechless. "You wish to understand this world," she said. "I can show you the deep places, the thinking places, but not as you are now. Your body shell is wrong for the deep paths. You must trust, and I must prepare you." The translator struggled with the final phrases, offering multiple possible interpretations. But one stood out that made his pulse quicken. She was offering to somehow modify his physiology so he could survive in environments where normal humans couldn't go. The scientific implications were beyond anything he'd imagined possible. What would that involve? He asked, though part of him already suspected the answer would challenge every assumption he'd made about the limits of biology. His response confirmed his suspicions and raised entirely new questions. The forest mind can change the deep patterns, remake the body song to match the world song, but the change is significant. You would remain yourself, but also become more, like my people learned to become long ago. She was talking about controlled evolution, directed mutation at the cellular level. The technology to accomplish such transformations was theoretical even by galactic standards, yet here it existed as part of a natural biological process. The others who come from Sky Rivers, continued, they will not understand. They will want to take to control to make the forest mind serve their needs, but you have the right scent. The forest mind tastes your thoughts and finds them good. It will accept you if you choose. As she prepared to leave, turned back with what was certain was a smile. Think carefully. Who seeks understanding? When the Sky River's calm and your voice can reach the far places again, you must choose. Call for your people to come with their taking tools and controlling thoughts, or trust the forest mind to show you wonders your kind has never dreamed. She vanished into the crystal trees as the first rays of dawn penetrated the dissipating storm clouds. Stood at his shelter's small window, watching her departure and trying to process everything that had happened. In the space of a few hours, his simple xenobiology mission had become something unprecedented in human history. He was being offered the chance to undergo transformation by an alien intelligence that existed on a planetary scale, to become something more than human while remaining fundamentally himself, to gain access to knowledge and perspectives that could revolutionize humanity's understanding of life in the universe. But accepting would mean abandoning everything he'd ever known, cutting ties with his own species, to forge a bond with an alien ecosystem that few humans would even believe existed. And if he chose to maintain his mission protocols and report everything to the Galactic Research Council, he would almost certainly be condemning people to extinction and the planetary intelligence to exploitation by humanity's less scrupulous factions. As communication systems came back online and the first messages from the orbital relay began to arrive, realized he was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life, and possibly the spent 3 days in agonizing deliberation. The messages from the orbital relay were routine mission status updates, equipment requests, reminders about upcoming supply drops. Dr. Reeves had sent a personal note expressing satisfaction with the quality of research data was transmitting. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan, which made his situation all the more surreal. He was sitting on information that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of biological systems, planetary intelligence, and the very nature of consciousness itself. Yet sharing that information would almost certainly doom the beings who had trusted him with it. The Galactic Research Council operated under strict protocols designed to prevent exploitation of primitive species. But people weren't primitive. They were the guardians of a form of intelligence that operated on scales humanity couldn't even comprehend. The problem was that most humans would see the crystal forest's capabilities and immediately begin calculating how to harness them for commercial or military purposes. Had worked with enough corporations and government agencies to know how the scenario would play out. First would come the planetary scientists, followed quickly by resource extraction specialists and terraforming engineers. Within a decade, Prime would be transformed into another industrial world, its unique ecosystem reduced to biological samples in laboratories across human space. But's offer represented something equally unprecedented. No human had ever been given the opportunity to undergo fundamental biological transformation by an alien intelligence. The potential for advancing human knowledge was incalculable, but so were the risks. He would be abandoning his species to join another, with no guarantee that the process would even work on human physiology. On the morning of the 4th day, made his decision. He crafted a carefully worded report to Dr. Reeves, emphasizing the remarkable diversity of life on Prime, while making no mention of intelligent inhabitants or planetary consciousness. His data supported everything he was saying. The planet was indeed a biological treasure trove worthy of continued study. But he recommended extending his mission by 6 months to conduct more comprehensive surveys before committing to full-scale research installations. The response came back within hours. Extension approved, additional supplies authorized, and congratulations on the quality of his preliminary findings. Had bought himself time to explore Saufer without triggering an immediate council response. That afternoon, he ventured into the crystal forest with a small beacon that would signal his location to orbital satellites. If something went wrong during the transformation process, at least search teams would know where to find his remains. It was a morbid thought, but had spent his career studying alien biology. He knew how many things could go fatally wrong when different evolutionary systems interacted. He found waiting in the clearing where he'd first left food offerings. She greeted him with obvious pleasure, her mastery of standard galactic improving with each conversation. The translator was now almost unnecessary for basic communication. "You have decided," she observed, studying his expression with those remarkable golden eyes. "I have questions first," replied. "About the process, about what I would become, about whether it can be reversed if necessary." Settled gracefully onto a fallen crystal trunk, her fur shifting to deeper amber shades that seemed to reflect her serious mood. "Ask. I will answer what I can, though some truths can only be understood through experience." Over the next several hours, learned more about species and their relationship with the planetary intelligence. Her people called themselves and they had achieved symbiosis with the crystal forest thousands of years ago during a period of ecological crisis. The transformation had saved them from extinction while granting them abilities that allowed them to serve as guardians of the world mind. The process itself involved exposure to specialized organisms that existed within the deepest parts of the forest. These beings, which called pattern weavers, could analyze an individual's genetic structure and modify it to be compatible with the crystal network. The changes were profound but gradual, taking place over several weeks as the subject's biology adapted to new realities. "What you would become," explained, "is still human in all the ways that matter. Your thoughts, your memories, your essential self, these remain unchanged. But your body gains new capabilities. Enhanced senses, improved physical abilities, and most importantly, the ability to interface directly with the forest mind." "And if I wanted to return to normal human physiology?" asked. Paused before answering. "Theoretically possible, but why would you choose to diminish yourself once you understand what you could become? None of my people have ever requested reversal." It wasn't exactly the reassurance had been hopping for, but he understood her point. She was offering him capabilities beyond normal human potential. From her perspective, choosing to give them up would seem incomprehensible. "There's another issue," said carefully. "Eventually, my people will come looking for me. When my mission ends, they'll expect me to return." "The forest mind has considered this," replied. "You could return to your people when necessary, though doing so would require temporary adjustments to hide the changes. But your true life would be here as a bridge between the world mind and the star travelers who will eventually come." She gestured toward the crystal trees surrounding them, their faceted surfaces beginning to glow as afternoon shifted toward evening. "The forest has been preparing for contact with your kind for generations. It knows that isolation cannot continue forever, but first contact must happen correctly with understanding rather than exploitation. You could ensure that happens." Realized she was offering him a role that went far beyond scientific research. He would become an ambassador between species, helping to guide humanity's inevitable expansion into this region of space. But to do so, he would need to transform into something that was no longer entirely human. "If I agree," he said slowly, "when would the process begin?" His expression brightened. "Tonight, if you are willing. The pattern weavers are most active during the dark hours, and your next supply drop is not for several days. By the time your people contact you again, the initial changes will be stable enough that you can function normally when necessary." That evening followed deeper into the crystal forest than he had ever traveled. The trees grew larger and more complex as they progressed, their interconnected branches forming canopies that pulsed with soft light. He began to understand what she meant about the forest thinking. There was a rhythm to the illumination, a pattern that suggested vast, slow thoughts moving through the living crystal network. "The forest mind wishes to meet you properly," explained as they approached what appeared to be a natural amphitheater formed by enormous crystal formations. "Before the change begins, it wants to understand your intentions." The center of the clearing contained a pool of liquid that reflected the crystal light in mesmerizing patterns. As approached, He felt a presence pressing gently against his consciousness. Not intrusive or threatening, but unmistakably alien and vast beyond human comprehension. Images began to form in his mind. He saw Prime as it had been ago, a world racked by ecological collapse as competing species drove each other toward extinction. He witnessed the emergence of the crystal forest as a stabilizing force, offering symbiosis to any species willing to surrender individual ambition for collective harmony. He observed the transformation of ancestors from aggressive predators into thoughtful guardians. And then he saw visions of the future. Human ships arriving in overwhelming numbers, corporate surveys marking profitable resources, terraforming equipment preparing to reshape the world according to human needs. But alongside those dark possibilities, he saw alternatives. Peaceful cooperation between species, knowledge shared rather than hoarded, the crystal forest's wisdom helping humanity to evolve beyond its destructive tendencies. The choice was his. The forest mind would not force transformation or cooperation. But if he was willing to serve as a bridge between worlds, it would grant him capabilities beyond anything human science had achieved. Looked at, who watched him with obvious hope, then at the pattern weavers beginning to emerge from the crystal formations around them. The organisms were unlike anything in his xenobiology, training translucent, constantly shifting beings that seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime. Yet their purpose was clear. They were tools of transformation, agents of evolution guided by a planetary intelligence that had been perfecting biological harmony for thousands of years. "I accept," he said quietly. What followed was the most remarkable night of his life. The pattern weavers surrounded him without touching, their presence somehow penetrating every cell of his body. He felt no pain, only a strange, tingling sensation as his genetic structure was analyzed and modified with precision beyond human technology. Remained beside him throughout the process, her hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture of support that transcended species boundaries. As the transformation began, she shared memories through their contact visions of what his enhanced senses would reveal, glimpses of the vast network of consciousness that connected every living thing on Prime. "Welcome to the world mind," she whispered as dawn approached and the pattern weavers. "Welcome to your new life." As consciousness returned, realized that everything had changed. His vision was sharper, revealing details in the crystal formations that he'd never noticed before. His hearing had expanded to encompass frequency ranges that opened up entirely new layers of forest communication. Most remarkably, he could feel the vast, slow pulse of the planetary intelligence, a rhythmic presence that connected him to every living thing around him. But perhaps most surprising was the realization that he still felt completely human. His thoughts, his personality, his memories, all remained intact. The transformation had added new capabilities without erasing his essential identity. "How do you feel?" asked, studying his face with obvious concern. Smiled, marveling at how the simple expression seemed to carry new depths of meaning. "Different, enhanced, but still myself." He paused, testing his new perceptions. "I can feel the forest thinking, it's incredible." His relief was obvious. The transformation is only beginning. Over the next several weeks, your capabilities will continue to develop. But the most important change has already occurred. You are now connected to the world mind, part of the greater consciousness that guides all life on Prime. As they made their way back toward his base camp, began to understand the full implications of what he'd done. He was no longer simply studying Prime, he was becoming part of it. But rather than feeling like a loss, it felt like the most natural evolution possible. The changes accelerated over the following weeks in ways that amazed even his enhanced understanding. His metabolism had adapted to process nutrients more efficiently, reducing his need for imported food supplies while allowing him to derive energy from local plants that would have been toxic to normal human physiology. His immune system had been reinforced with alien adaptations that made him effectively immune to Prime's biological hazards. Most remarkably, his nervous system was developing new pathways that allowed direct interface with the crystal forest's communication network. What had initially felt like a gentle presence in the back of his mind was becoming a constant stream of information, whether patterns, seasonal changes, the health status of different forest regions, even early warnings about geological activity. Had become his guide through this transformation, teaching him to interpret the vast flow of data and control his new abilities. Her patience was extraordinary, though suspected she was enjoying the process as much as he was. For her, he represented the possibility of renewed contact with the wider universe after generations of isolation. "Your people?" she asked one morning as they practiced integrating human technology with forest mind capabilities. "What are they like beyond their tools and starships?" Paused in his calibration of a sensor array that could now interface directly with his enhanced nervous system. The question touched on something he'd been struggling with since the transformation began. The more connected he became to Prime's planetary consciousness, the more his perspective on human civilization was shifting. "Complicated," he admitted. "Humans can be incredibly creative and generous, capable of remarkable compassion and cooperation, but we also have tendencies toward competition and resource acquisition that can be problematic when we encounter something we want to control or possess." Settled beside him, her fur shifting to thoughtful blue-gray patterns. "The forest mind has touched the edges of human thoughts through your connections. It finds your species fascinating but also concerning. There is great potential for harmony but also for conflict." Over their weeks together, had learned to read emotional states through her chromatic changes and body language. Her current configuration suggested deep consideration of weighty matters, which usually preceded important conversations. "There is something I must tell you," she continued. "The forest mind has detected approaching ships at the edge of your solar system, not the supply vessel you expect, but larger craft with different energy signatures." Felt ice in his stomach despite his enhanced physiology. How long until they arrive? The calculations are difficult across such distances, but the forest mind estimates perhaps 10 to 12 of your days. And these ships carry the scent traces of significant military capability. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Someone had either detected anomalies in his reports or discovered independent evidence of Prime's value. Corporate research fleets rarely traveled with military escorts unless they expected resistance or were planning to claim resources by force. "I need to check my communications," said, already moving toward his base camp. "If someone else has discovered this system, there may be messages I haven't received." The review of his communication logs revealed what he'd feared. 3 days ago, while he'd been deep in the forest learning to interface with crystal formations, an encrypted message had arrived from Dr. Reeves. The encryption was military-grade, far beyond standard research protocols. After several hours of careful decryption using techniques that would have been impossible before his transformation, accessed the message and felt his world shift. The content was brief but devastating. "Preliminary analysis of your data samples indicates presence of unknown organic computing substrates with potential military applications. Expeditionary fleet departing immediately under Joint Council corporate authority. Maintain mission parameters until arrival. Do not attempt independent contact with any discovered intelligence. Orders from Admiral Council Defense Division." Stared at the message, understanding finally dawning. His carefully neutral reports had still contained enough information for the right analysts to recognize the significance of what he'd found. Someone had connected his descriptions of crystalline organisms with complex chemical interactions to theoretical research on biological computing systems. Humanity's military-industrial complex had concluded that Prime might contain the key to organic technologies that could revolutionize warfare and information processing. They were coming to claim those resources, regardless of any indigenous inhabitants. "Bad news?" asked, reading his expression with the ease of someone who shared his neural pathways. "Worse than bad," replied. He explained the situation, watching as her fur shifted to alarmed crimson patterns. "We have at most 12 days before a military fleet arrives with authorization to claim this world for human exploitation." For the first time since he'd known her, looked genuinely frightened. Not for herself, but for the planetary consciousness that had become such an integral part of his existence. Through their shared connection, he could feel the forest mind's growing distress as it processed the implications of human arrival. "Can you stop them?" she asked. "Warn them away or convince them that this world has no value?" Shook his head. "The authorization comes from the highest levels of human government. Once a military expedition is launched, only direct orders from the Galactic Council can countermand it. And those orders would only come if we could prove that claiming this world would violate sentient rights accords." "But my people are sentient. You've spoken with me, learned our language, seen our intelligence. Individual sentience isn't enough, explained, hatting every word. The Accords require proof of technological civilization, cities, industry, space travel capability. Your people's harmony with nature actually works against you under human law. Through his connection to the forest mind, felt a vast sadness settling over the planetary consciousness. It had hoped for peaceful contact with humanity, but instead faced conquest and exploitation by beings who would see its living crystal network as nothing more than biological machinery to be harvested. There is one possibility, said slowly, but it would require you to make a choice that could not be undone. Looked at her questioningly, nodding the serious amber patterns flowing through her fur. The forest mind can complete your transformation fully, she explained. Make you entirely one with the planetary consciousness while maintaining your human memories and knowledge. You would become what my people call a voice, an individual who can speak for the world mind with complete authority. What would that mean practically? You would possess capabilities beyond anything human science understands. The ability to interface directly with any technology, to process information at speeds that approach the forest mind itself, to defend this world using resources your people cannot even detect. Paused. But the change would be permanent and profound. You would remain, but you would also be something entirely new. Through his growing connection to the planetary consciousness, could sense the desperate hope emanating from the forest mind. It was offering him power beyond human imagination, but at the cost of his fundamental humanity. Yet what choice did he have? Allow the world mind to be destroyed by human greed, or transform himself into something that could stand against a military fleet? How long would the process take? He asked. 3 days, replied. But you must understand, once begun, this transformation cannot be stopped or reversed. You would be forever changed. Closed his eyes, feeling the weight of an entire world's future resting on his decision. Through his enhanced senses, he could perceive the vast network of life that depended on the forest mind's guidance. Millions of species, countless ecosystems, all hanging in the balance. But he also thought of his own species, of the humans who would arrive expecting to find mineral resources and biological samples. They wouldn't understand what they were destroying until it was too late. Perhaps, as a voice for the world mind, he could find a way to protect both civilizations. What would my capabilities be exactly? He asked. Smiled, her fur brightening to hopeful gold. The forest mind wishes to show you rather than tell you. Will you allow a deeper connection? Nodded and immediately felt his consciousness expand exponentially. For a brief moment, he experienced existence from the perspective of an intelligence that spanned continents. He felt every organism on Prime as an extension of himself, sensed the vast computational processes that maintained ecological balance, understood the true scope of what the crystal forest had achieved. But more importantly, he gained insight into the defensive capabilities the planetary consciousness had developed over. Biological warfare systems that could be activated without harming the ecosystem. Electromagnetic pulse generation through crystal formations. Most intriguingly, the ability to manipulate local spacetime through quantum effects generated by the living crystal network. The arriving fleet, said as the connection stabilized, their weapons and shields, the forest mind could neutralize them. Without harming the crews, confirmed. The world mind has no desire to destroy life, only to protect itself, but it requires a voice who understands both civilizations to guide such actions. Made his decision, begin the transformation. The next 3 days passed in a blur of biological change that made his initial transformation seem minor by comparison. The pattern weavers worked continuously, rebuilding his neural pathways and enhancing his cellular structure until he existed in a state somewhere between human and planetary consciousness. Remained with him throughout, serving as both guide and anchor to his individual identity. Without her presence, suspected he might have been absorbed entirely into the forest mind's vast awareness. Instead, he retained his sense of self while gaining access to capabilities that redefine the boundaries of biological possibility. When the process was complete, found himself looking at reality through entirely new perceptions. He could sense the approaching human fleet as distortions in local space-time, track their communications through quantum fluctuations, even analyze their weapons systems through electromagnetic signatures. But most importantly, he could feel the fear and hope of every living thing on Prime. The responsibility was overwhelming, but so was the certainty that he had made the right choice. "Welcome, voice," said formally. "The world mind greets you as both guardian and guide." Smiled, feeling power beyond human comprehension flowing through his transformed consciousness. "Then, let's prepare to give our visitors a welcome they'll never forget." The final confrontation was approaching, and guard the human fleet dropped out of hyperspace exactly when the forest mind had predicted, their arrival sending ripples through local space-time that felt like thunder in his enhanced consciousness. Through his connection to the planetary intelligence, he could perceive their formation with perfect clarity. 3 heavy cruisers, 2 science vessels, and a command carrier that bristled with enough firepower to glass a small continent. Admiral had brought enough military force to claim Prime against significant resistance. The irony wasn't lost on humanity had come expecting a fight and would find one, but not from the direction they anticipated. "Incoming transmission from the fleet commander," reported from where she monitored human communication frequencies through modified equipment. "They're demanding immediate contact with Dr." Smiled, his transformed consciousness already reaching out through the crystal forest's communication network to touch the fleet's electronics. Through quantum interfaces that human technology couldn't even detect, he began mapping their systems with an intimacy that would have shocked their engineers. "Open a channel," he said. "It's time for Admiral to learn what he's really dealing with." The main in his transformed research station flickered to life, revealing a stern-faced woman in military uniform. Admiral Sarah looked exactly like had expected from her reputation, professional, determined, and utterly convinced of human superiority in any conflict. "Doctor," she said without preamble, "you're 3 days overdue for your scheduled check-in. Explain your status immediately." "My status is excellent, Admiral," replied calmly, "though I suspect it's not what you're hopping to hear." His eyes narrowed as she studied his appearance. Hadn't bothered to hide the physical changes that marked him as no longer entirely human. His skin carried subtle patterns that reflected the crystal forest's influence, and his eyes now held the same inner luminescence that characterized species. "Doctor, you appear to be suffering from some form of biological contamination. We're prepared to implement emergency decontamination procedures." "What I'm experiencing isn't contamination, Admiral. It's evolution." Leaned forward, allowing her to see the full extent of his transformation. "I've been invited to join something far greater than anything human science has achieved." Through his connection to the fleet systems, felt the spike in electrical activity as emergency protocols activated. The Admiral was already classifying him as a compromised asset, potentially hostile. Exactly what he'd expected from someone trained to see every situation in terms of threat assessment and resource acquisition. "Doctor, you are suffering from alien influence and are no longer competent to continue this mission. Stand down immediately and prepare for extraction." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," replied. Through the forest mind, he reached out to touch the fleet's navigation computers. "You see, Admiral, you're operating under several false assumptions about this system." Warning klaxons began sounding on the command carrier as navigation systems reported impossible readings. Was gently demonstrating that the fleet's technological superiority was an illusion. He could access their systems as easily as walking through an open door. "What the hell is happening to my ships?" demanded, her professional composure cracking slightly. "You're encountering a form of intelligence that exists on scales your civilization hasn't learned to recognize," explained patiently. "Prime isn't simply a world with unusual biological resources. It's a living entity, a planetary consciousness that has been observing your approach with considerable interest." Through his enhanced perceptions, felt the forest mind extending its awareness toward the human fleet. Not aggressively, but with the careful attention of a vast intelligence trying to understand these strange visitors. The contrast between the planetary consciousness's patient curiosity and the fleet's hostile readiness was almost heartbreaking. "Doctor," Admiral said with forced calm, "you've clearly been compromised by some form of alien neural manipulation. We're going to help you, but first you need to disable whatever defensive systems are affecting our navigation." "Admiral, I want you to understand something," said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the crystal formations around him. "I am no longer the you sent to study this world. I am the voice of a planetary intelligence that has existed for thousands of years. I speak for every living thing on Prime, and I'm telling you that your presence here constitutes an act of aggression against a sentient being. His expression hardened. Doctor, you have 30 seconds to restore control of our systems, or I will authorize the use of force to secure this planet. Felt the forest mind's sadness at the human inability to recognize anything beyond their own narrow perspective. But beneath that sadness was a steely determination to protect the countless species that depended on the planetary consciousness for their survival. Admiral said softly, I tried to do this peacefully. What happened next would be remembered in human military history as the day an entire fleet was defeated without a single shot being fired. Through his connection to the forest mind, reached out to the quantum foundations of the ship systems and simply changed them. The fleet's weapons powered down not through external interference, but because their control circuits had been convinced they were already in standby mode. Life support systems continued functioning perfectly, while navigation computers reported that the ships were docked at friendly stations. Most impressively, the ship's AI systems became convinced they were participating in a peaceful first contact scenario rather than a military operation. How are you doing this? Whispered as her command staff reported total system failure across the entire fleet. The same way you think, Admiral, replied. Through electromagnetic patterns, quantum field fluctuations, and information processing. The difference is that my consciousness now operates on scales that encompass this entire world. He could see the Admiral struggling to process the implications. Her entire worldview was built on the assumption of human technological superiority, but that assumption had just been shattered by a force she couldn't understand or combat. What do you want? She asked finally. I want you to understand what you came here to destroy, said. Will you allow me to show you? What followed was the most remarkable first contact in human history. Through his connection to the planetary intelligence, shared the forest mind's perspective with Admiral and her senior officers. They experienced existence as a consciousness that spanned continents, felt the delicate balance of ecosystems that supported millions of species, understood the vast computational processes that maintained planetary stability. More importantly, they felt the forest mind's genuine curiosity about humanity and its desire for peaceful cooperation. The planetary intelligence harbored no hostility toward the newcomers, only sadness at their inability to see beyond resource extraction and territorial acquisition. When the connection ended, Admiral sat in stunned silence for several minutes. That was incredible, she admitted finally. But Doctor, my orders come from the highest levels of human government. I can't simply ignore them because of what you've shown me. I understand, replied. But you can communicate what you've learned to those authorities. Tell them that Prime is not an unclaimed resource to be exploited. It's a sentient being that offers partnership rather than conquest. Through his enhanced perception, felt the forest mind considering possibilities for cooperation that could benefit both civilizations. Humanity's expansion could continue, but guided by wisdom rather than driven by greed. The planetary consciousness could share knowledge that would help humans develop sustainable technologies and understand their place in the greater community of intelligent life. The forest mind is willing to share its knowledge freely, continued. Technologies that could solve humanity's energy problems, biological systems that could heal damaged worlds, computational methods that could revolutionize artificial intelligence, all offered in friendship, not taken by force. Admiral studied transformed features with growing understanding. And what role would you play in such cooperation? I would remain as voice, translating between human ambition and planetary wisdom, helping both sides understand each other's perspectives and needs. Smiled, feelings presence beside him through their shared connection. It's what I was trained to do just on a scale I never imagined possible. The negotiations that followed were complex and sometimes heated, but the outcome was never in doubt. Faced with a form of intelligence they couldn't defeat or control, humanity's leadership was forced to consider cooperation as an alternative to conquest. The forest mind's offer of shared knowledge proved too valuable to refuse, especially when delivered through someone who understood human motivations and concerns. Spent the following months establishing protocols for peaceful contact between human civilization and the planetary consciousness. Scientists were allowed to visit in small groups, always with careful supervision to ensure they understood the respect required when dealing with a living world. In return, the forest mind shared technological innovations that advanced human understanding by centuries. But perhaps most importantly, had established a precedent for how humanity could interact with forms of intelligence they didn't initially recognize. His transformation from to planetary voice became a model for future encounters with truly alien consciousness. Remained his closest companion throughout the transition, her people emerging from the deep forests to serve as guides for visiting humans. The proved remarkably adaptable, learning human languages and customs while teaching visitors to perceive the subtle signs of planetary consciousness. "Do you ever regret your choice?" asked one evening as they watched a joint human research team conducting studies in the crystal forest. Considered the question while feeling the vast, patient presence of the forest mind flowing through his consciousness. He was no longer entirely human, but he had gained something far more valuable than what he'd lost. Purpose on a scale that transcended individual ambition. Connection to an intelligence that offered perspectives impossible for any single being to achieve. "Never," he said finally. "I found what every scientist dreams of, the chance to be part of something greater than themselves while still remaining who they are." Through his transformed senses, could feel the contentment of the planetary consciousness as it continued its ancient work of nurturing life. But now that work included guiding humanity toward a more sustainable and harmonious future, helping his former species learn to see beyond their immediate desires. The foxwoman who had stalked him through the crystal forest had offered him transformation beyond his wildest dreams. In accepting, had not only saved two civilizations from conflict, but had helped establish a new model for human expansion into the galaxy, one based on cooperation rather than conquest. As night fell over Prime and the crystal forest began its ancient song, smiled at the irony. He had come to study alien life and had instead become something alien himself. But in doing so, he had helped ensure that both humanity and the planetary consciousness would thrive in the ages to come. The forest mind pulsed with quiet satisfaction, its vast thoughts touched with something very much like love for the strange little human who had chosen to become its voice. And in that acceptance, found a peace deeper than anything his merely human existence had ever offered. He was home in ways he had never imagined possible. And voice of a planetary intelligence was ready to protect his new home from the species he had once called his own. The challenge now would be learning to balance his dual nature as both human researcher and guardian of an alien world mind. His next communication with the Galactic Research Council would require careful navigation as he continued his mission while protecting the secrets that had been entrusted to him. But for the first time since arriving on Prime, felt truly at home relationship between humanity and one of the most remarkable forms of intelligence ever discovered. The storm had passed, but the real tempest was just beginning,